The river ran slow that evening, like it was dragging memories instead of water. Its surface glinted gold, then silver, then nothing as the sun dipped behind the hills. A lone cowboy rode beside it, reins loose in his hand, his eyes scanning the shore like a man not quite sure what he was looking for, or maybe like a man who didn't want to look too close at anything anymore. Dust clung to him. Not just from the road, but from years of silence and losing things that didn't come back. He hadn't had a proper name in some time, not one anyone used. Folks just called him the quiet one down by the old river fork. He didn't correct them. He'd stopped caring what people thought, stopped caring what the world expected, ever since the war took his brother and left him with a scar under his ribs that still twitched every time it rained. The horse paused. Ears flicked. Something wasn't right. That's when he heard it. A splash. Then another. Not a fish, not an animal, not something wild. Something human. The kind of sound a body makes when it's too tired to fight anymore. He kicked his boots and rode hard toward the bank, pulling up just where the water curved around a bend. And there she was. A girl in the river. She was flailing, arms weak, mouth barely above the current. Her dress clung to her, dragging her down. Her hair, long and black as river mud, tangled behind her like a snare. No scream came. Just panic. Quiet, desperate panic. He didn't shout. He didn't waste time asking why. Just slid off the horse, tossed his hat to the brush, and stepped into the water boots and all. The cold bit sharp, knife to bone, but he'd known worse. The river wasn't deep, but the current had teeth. She was small, but the panic made her heavy. When he reached her, she thrashed once, hit him in the jaw. He didn't flinch. Just wrapped one arm around her and pulled her against him like someone trying to keep the pieces of a broken vase from spilling out. She gasped when they reached the shore. Coughed. Shivered. Her lips were turning blue. He laid her down on the dry grass, took off his coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She curled into herself, silent, knees pulled to her chest. "You hurt?" he asked softly. No answer. He repeated it, slower. Still nothing. But this time she looked at him, and in her eyes, black glass rimmed with red, he saw not confusion, but understanding. She knew what he meant. She just didn't have the words to answer. Her face was pale, skin like porcelain that had seen one too many winters. Not a scratch on her, but her expression told him she'd been through worse than rocks and river. She had the look of someone who expected hands to hurt, not help. He crouched beside her. His coat hung off her shoulders like it didn't know how to belong. She kept pulling it tighter, like she was trying to disappear into it. He pointed at himself, tapped his chest. "John," he said. She blinked. He tried again, slower. "John." No reaction. Not even a nod. She wasn't from around here. That much was clear. He sighed, stood up, glanced toward the trail. The sun had all but gone now. Coyotes would be out soon. He couldn't leave her here. She wouldn't last a night. So he did the only thing that made sense. Lifted her, gently, like lifting something already cracked, and set her on his horse. She didn't fight. Didn't thank him either. Just held on to the saddle horn with fingers that trembled like candle flames. The ride back to his cabin was quiet. She didn't look around, didn't ask where they were going. Just stared at the dirt road ahead like she already knew what was coming and had stopped being surprised by any of it. His cabin was small, made of timber he'd cut himself. Nothing fancy, just a stove, a cot, a table, a rocking chair that creaked when it rained. But it was warm, and it was safe. He helped her down. She stumbled. He caught her elbow. She pulled away quick, not out of pride, but out of memory. He didn't push it. Inside, he lit the stove and laid a blanket near the hearth. She sat there without needing to be told. Pulled his coat tighter. Her eyes kept darting to the corners, like she was checking for exits. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, sipped slowly, then set it down and folded her arms. They sat in silence. The fire crackled. Outside, a wind brushed against the walls like an old dog sniffing at the seams. He watched her. Not like a man watching a woman, but like someone watching a storm rolling in, quiet, careful, waiting to see if it would pass or break everything. She had a scar on her wrist. A thin line, almost faded. But it was there. And he noticed how she flinched whenever a log popped too loud in the fire. Eventually she looked up. Her lips moved. He leaned in. "May," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Just a name. Soft as silk unraveling in the dark. He nodded. "May." She touched her chest. Then looked down. He didn't push for more. That night, he offered her the cot. She refused it at first. Sat by the fire, knees hugged tight. Eventually, she lay on the rug, not far from the flame, as if the heat might erase whatever came before. He watched her sleep from his chair. Thought about the river. How it had nearly taken her. How he might have let it, if he hadn't heard, if he hadn't looked up right then. He didn't believe in fate, not really. But something about the way she clung to life, barely, stubbornly, made him wonder if maybe some people were meant to be found, even when they weren't looking to be. He stayed up a while. Didn't need much sleep these days anyway. The fire slowly dimmed, and outside the coyotes howled at nothing in particular. Before he let his eyes close, he whispered to no one. "Reckon you'll need a place for a while, May." She didn't stir. But for the first time since he found her, her brow smoothed, just a little. And somewhere, between silence and ash, something began to change in the room. Something small. Something like trust. By dawn, the air had shifted. Not quite safe, not quite certain, but warmer. And though the cowboy didn't know it yet, the river hadn't just carried her to him. It had carried him back to himself. Morning came slow. Mist clung to the earth like breath that hadn't let go. May sat near the hearth with her knees drawn up, steam rising from the cup in her hands. John moved quietly behind her, cooking eggs in a skillet that still remembered campfire soot. The cabin didn't speak much, it never had, but something in it had softened, as though it had begun learning the shape of a second heartbeat. She watched him while pretending not to. Her eyes followed his movements, unsure if he would change, shift, turn cold. But he didn't. He cracked eggs. Poured coffee. Set 2 plates at the table like it was any other morning. He glanced at her, gestured toward the chair. "Eat." She didn't move. He walked to the table, sat, began eating with calm rhythm, not forcing, not coaxing. After a minute, she rose and followed. Sat across from him. Her fork shook when she lifted it, but she ate. Carefully. Slowly. The silence between them wasn't heavy. Just new. When the meal was done, she stood and picked up his plate before he could. Washed it in the basin by the window. Her movements were exact, like she'd been trained to do it right or be punished. He noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he walked outside and began chopping wood. The thud of the axe echoed through the clearing, breaking the morning like a metronome. May stood at the doorway, watching. Her hands wrung at her sides, but her eyes stayed steady. Later, she found a broom tucked behind the stove. Began sweeping. Not because she was asked, because she needed to. Because it was easier to move than to sit with what couldn't be spoken. By afternoon, she was hanging washed clothes outside on the line. The sunlight touched her face, and she flinched at first, like brightness wasn't something she expected to survive. Then she tilted her head upward and let it rest there a moment longer. John watched from the porch, a book unopened on his lap. He hadn't had a woman on this land since his sister died back east. And now here was this girl, quiet as the wind and just as restless. Not a guest. Not a prisoner. Just there. She approached him after sundown, a folded paper in her hand. She tapped her chest, then unfolded the paper. On it, in slanted strokes, were Chinese characters he couldn't read. She pointed to herself, then to the paper. He didn't understand. She hesitated. Then, slowly, wrote beside the symbols in shaky, borrowed English. May. He nodded. May, he repeated. She pointed to him. He smiled faintly, touched his chest. John! Za and... she tried. He chuckled once. Not loud. Not mocking. Just soft, amused warmth. They spent the evening trading words. May pointed to things, table, fire, window, and repeated what he said. He stumbled through her words too. Laughter came. Not much, but enough to feel like a seed had been planted. That night, she stayed inside the cabin, curling up on the rug with a blanket. He left the door open a crack, firelight dancing on the walls. Before she closed her eyes, she whispered one word he hadn't taught her. Safe. He didn't ask how she knew it. He didn't need to. The days found rhythm. John would rise early to feed the animals. May swept, cooked rice in a small pot she brought from somewhere he didn't ask about. They spoke in pieces. Words patched together like a quilt neither had the pattern for. But it was enough. Then, one morning, the world came knocking. It wasn't loud. Just the slow approach of hooves down the trail. John looked up from repairing the fence and saw the dust rising. A single rider. A woman. Mrs. Lindell. She was hard-eyed, tall-backed, her gray hair tied in a tight bun like it had never dared loosen. She rode up slow, dismounted, eyes fixed on the cabin door behind him. You've got company, she said, not asking. John nodded once. She sniffed. Saw the tracks near the river. There was talk in town. Some folks say a Chinese girl washed ashore. Some say she didn't. John's voice stayed even. She's not trouble. Mrs. Lindell's eyes narrowed. She don't belong here. These parts ain't kind to foreigners. You know that. She's under my roof. That won't matter if the law comes sniffing. I'll deal with the law. Mrs. Lindell crossed her arms. You sure you're thinking straight? You know what folks'll say. He stepped forward. I've heard worse. May stood just inside the door, watching them through the crack. Her body tense. Her breath shallow. Mrs. Lindell looked toward the cabin. She speak English? A little. She know what she is here? John didn't answer that. With a huff, Mrs. Lindell turned to mount her horse. You were a good boy once, John. I hope you still know right from foolish. She rode off. When he turned back, May had disappeared inside. He found her kneeling by the fire, hands clenched in her lap. She think I bad, she said, her voice small. He crouched beside her. No. She don't understand. May looked down. Many don't understand. He didn't have words for that. Only the weight of truth between them. The next few days were quiet. May spoke less. She moved slower, as if afraid that each step might break what little place she'd made for herself. John tried to bridge it. He showed her how to saddle the horse. Gave her small seeds to plant near the porch. She smiled once when she pressed her fingers into the soil. That evening, she brought out a brush and began combing her long black hair on the porch. John sat nearby, whittling. She held out the brush to him. He hesitated. Then took it. He brushed her hair with slow, careful strokes, the way he'd once seen his mother do for his sister. May closed her eyes. Not asleep, just resting. Her shoulders softened. It wasn't love yet. Not the kind they wrote songs about. But it was something quieter, deeper. A peace neither had known before. Later that night, as the fire crackled low, May pointed to the stars. In halting English, she said, Back home, same stars. He looked up. Maybe that's how we find home, he said softly. Not places. Not names. Just what stays the same. She didn't answer. But she reached out and touched his hand. He let her. Outside, the river kept running. Not as a threat now, but as memory. And though the world beyond still loomed with its laws and whispers, for this night, under shared stars and borrowed words, two strangers sat close enough to almost belong. And neither wanted the morning to come too soon. Summer had begun to settle into the land, spreading gold across the prairie like butter melting on old bread. Days were longer now, stretched thin and warm, and the world seemed gentler in the hush between sunup and supper. May had started humming while she swept the porch, soft and low, a tune without words that sounded like rivers and falling petals. John listened from inside, pretending not to, letting the notes drift through the open window like perfume from a life he didn't know he'd wanted. She had begun to draw in the dirt with a stick, flowers, branches, sometimes the symbol of a bird, and every so often she'd glance toward him, not quite asking for approval, but hoping it landed somewhere safe. He never said much. Just nodded. But she read the silence right. She always did. Then came the sound neither of them wanted to hear again. Horses. 2 of them this time, their hooves pounding steady and sharp against the trail like a warning bell. John stepped off the porch and met them before they reached the gate. One man wore a dark coat, well pressed, and boots polished too clean for a man who rode dusty roads. The other, older, heavier, with a handlebar mustache and the swagger of someone used to getting what he wanted without asking twice. The younger one spoke first. "Marshal Cray," he said, tipping his hat. "This here's Deputy Lorne." John gave a nod. "Something I can help with?" Cray glanced past him, eyes scanning the porch, the window, the fields. "Heard a girl came through these parts a few weeks back. Chinese. Young. Small. Thought maybe she was headed for the railroad towns, but—" he squinted. "Heard otherwise." John didn't answer. Cray smiled like a man who liked hearing himself talk. "Now I'm just doing my duty. Law says any foreign nationals without proper entry papers are to be reported and detained. That's federal, not just county." He clicked his tongue. "A girl like that, well, she don't belong out here. Not unless she's registered. You understand?" John's hands stayed at his sides. "She's not causing harm. That ain't the point. The law don't measure harm, it measures legality." The older man, Lorne, spit into the dirt. "Some folks say she came from smugglers. Maybe jumped a boat. Maybe she was bought." John's jaw twitched. "She's not cargo." "She yours, then?" Cray asked, eyes narrowing. "That what this is?" John didn't blink. "She's under my roof." Cray leaned forward slightly. "That roof won't save you when the feds come knocking. We're giving you a chance to do the right thing. Just point us in the direction she went. We'll handle the rest." Inside the cabin, May stood motionless behind the wall, eyes wide, breath quiet. She didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. John didn't move. "You've done your visit," he said. "Unless you've got paper in hand, you're done here." Cray chuckled. "You always were a hard one, John. You think you're protecting her? You're just dragging her deeper." The marshal turned his horse with a snap. "We'll be back. Next time with writs." When they were gone, John returned inside. May stood by the window, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "They want take me," she said, voice barely more than breath. He took off his hat, set it gently on the table. "They're trying." She looked at him with fear sharpened to anger. "I not slave. I know. I not paper." He stepped closer. "You're not. You're a person. They just don't see it." She looked down. Her hands trembled. He wanted to reach out, but didn't. Not yet. Instead, he sat by the fire and let the silence open its arms. That night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. The next morning, she found him by the river, watching the current roll by like it carried answers he couldn't read. "They come back," she said quietly. "They will." She nodded, slow. "I go?" "No," he said, then softer. "Not unless you want to." Her eyes met his. They were steadier now, rooted. "I stay." From then on, the routine shifted. May kept watch on the ridge while John worked the land. He taught her how to load the rifle, though either of them wanted to use it. She learned quickly. Sharp-eyed. Steady-handed. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, and rain traced lines down the windows, she whispered something she hadn't before. "My father was teacher. Before war. He say words are seeds." John stirred beside the fire, listening. He die. Uncle sell me. I forget father's face, but not words. She looked at her palms. You helped me grow new ones. He didn't speak. Just reached over and handed her a small book from his shelf. Blank pages. Unwritten. She took it like a gift made of light. Over the next few days she filled it with symbols, Chinese, English, drawings of clouds and crows and the fire and the hearth. She used the words she could say and the ones she couldn't yet, sketching memory into permanence. One morning she woke before him, left a drawing on the table. It showed a house with 2 trees, a horse in front, and 2 stick figures, one brushing the other's hair. He stared at it a long time. Later that week, they walked into town together for supplies. Heads turned. Some stared openly. A boy hissed something cruel behind his mother's skirt. May didn't flinch. She just looked forward, chin lifted, hand resting on John's arm, not clutching, just touching. At the general store, Mrs. Lindell watched them enter with eyes that didn't blink. When they brought their goods to the counter, she rang them up in silence. As they turned to leave, she said softly, "You'll need more than love to keep her safe." John met her gaze. "Then I'll find more." Outside, the wind had picked up. May pulled her shawl tighter, and John offered his coat without a word. On the ride home, she looked up at the sky. "Storm soon." "Yeah," he said. "But it'll pass." She turned to him, something steady in her eyes. "You stay?" He nodded. "I'm here." And for the first time since the river tried to take her, she smiled without fear, without measure. That night, she sat by the fire and braided her hair. When she was done, she handed him the brush. He didn't ask. Just took it, and began again, stroke by stroke, until her hair lay smooth like silk across her back and the world outside the cabin had nothing left to threaten them, only time, slow and full. In the soft flicker of that moment, they didn't yet know what the law would do, or what they would lose to keep each other. But they knew this: love, when chosen freely and tended like a field, can root itself even in stolen land. And that was enough for now. The sun had not yet risen when John woke to the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps at the door, too heavy to be a neighbor, too early to be anything kind. He was already dressed. Something in his bones had warned him before sleep even found him last night. May sat up from her cot by the fire, blanket clutched around her shoulders, eyes wide but calm. She had begun to read signs the way some read sky, silent but certain. She didn't ask who it was. She knew. John opened the door to Marshal Cray and 2 men in gray coats, all on horseback. The law rode heavy this time. They didn't wait for an invitation. Cray dismounted, stepped forward, paper in hand. "Got the warrant this time." "Official." "Federal." He nodded toward the others. "These boys are here to ensure cooperation." John stood in the doorway, unmoved. "She hasn't done harm. You know that." "That's not how it works," Cray said. "She's undocumented. Smuggled. Doesn't matter if she's guilty of sin or saintliness. She's illegal. That's all they care about in Washington." He took another step. "You harbor her, you're in violation. Harbor her knowingly, you're part of the network. You want to go down with her, fine. But they'll burn your land to get to her." Inside, May had risen to her feet, holding the small book of drawings against her chest like it might protect her. Her eyes were unreadable. John turned, looked at her. She didn't cry. He nodded once, the smallest motion. She returned it. Then, everything moved fast. A crack of motion. A door slammed. Boots on wood. By the time Cray stepped inside, John was gone. Outside, the cabin's back door creaked on its hinges. The lawmen scattered. Cray barked orders, but the prairie swallowed sound the way it swallowed time. By the time they reached the far ridge, John and May were gone. The wagon groaned under the weight of hay and supplies, wheels spinning dust into the sunrise. May was hidden beneath sacks of oats, her breast shallow, her arms wrapped around the tin book as if every word inside it was a prayer. John sat up front, reins gripped hard, rifle across his lap, heart loud in his chest. They rode without speaking. Past the abandoned mine. Past the dry creek. Toward the old missionary outpost where, years ago, the sisters had taken in travelers and misfits with nowhere to go. He'd been there once, long ago, after the war. A man without a plan, with a bullet in his side and a sky too wide to face. He didn't believe in salvation anymore, but he believed in shelter. They reached the outpost by nightfall. Just a slanted roof and a crumbling chapel with ivy curling up the walls. The preacher met them at the gate, Reverend Gaines, weathered, sunburnt, no stranger to fugitives or ghosts. "She's Chinese," John said before the man could ask. "She's got no papers. They're coming for her." The preacher squinted. "You married?" John hesitated. "No," he said. Gaines shook his head slowly. "Then you haven't given her anything the law respects. She's not safe here. Not unless something binds her to you tighter than pity." John looked down. "She's more than pity." "I don't doubt it," Gaines said. "But you're riding into a storm with a matchstick. She needs a name that can't be taken from her." That night, John didn't sleep. He sat by the chapel, listening to the creak of wind and the cry of the prairie birds. May sat beside him, her knees drawn up, watching the stars. She pointed to the sky. "They always move, but stay." He nodded. "They do." She turned to him. "I no want run always." He met her eyes. "You shouldn't have to." She placed the tin book between them. Open to a page where she'd drawn the house, the fire, the porch swing he never used but she cleaned anyway. "You, my safe," she said. His throat tightened. "I marry you," she added, not a question, not a plea. A choice. He didn't say yes with words. Just reached for her hand and held it in both of his. The next morning, they stood in the chapel with a witness, the old preacher and the only sister still there, silent as a stone angel. There were no rings. No white dress. Just two hands meeting in the dusty glow of a stained glass window. "I give you my name," John said. "Not because it's clean. But because it's yours now, too." May spoke only 2 words. "Thank you." Reverend Gaines stamped the certificate with a rusty seal and handed it over. "No," he said. "She's more trouble to take than to leave." They rode back slowly, under heavy sky. May wore John's coat, the one she'd first clung to near the river. The wind had turned, and the smell of rain pressed into the land. But it wasn't Law that found them next. It was Cray. He was waiting by the creek, boots muddy, arms crossed, coat flapping in the wind. He wasn't smiling this time. "Think a piece of paper fixes this?" he asked. John dismounted, handed May the reins. "She's my wife." Cray snorted. "Convenient." John's voice was calm. "Legal." Cray took a step forward. "I could call your marriage a fraud. I could say she coerced you, or you coerced her. You don't think I can twist this?" John didn't flinch. "You can try. But you'll have to explain why you're so interested in one small woman who never broke a law except being born across the ocean." Cray's jaw worked. "You think love puts you above the law?" John's voice dropped low. "No. I think love's the only thing worth breaking it for." Behind him, May stood tall. Not hiding. Not pleading. Her eyes were full of wind and water and words she hadn't spoken yet but carried all the same. From the trees, another horse approached. Mrs. Lindell rode up slow, her gray hair wild from the ride. She looked at Cray. Then at John. Then at May. She held up a folded paper. "I signed as witness," she said. "I'll testify it wasn't fraud." Cray glared. "You'll regret that." Mrs. Lindell didn't blink. "I've lived long enough to regret worse." Cray spat on the dirt. Turned his horse without another word. The law would return. Of course it would. But for now, they had bought time. As the sky split open with the first streak of lightning, John turned to May. "We'll plant plum trees near the porch," she said. He smiled, the kind that broke through years of frost. "You sure?" I plant roots, she answered. Here. That night, they sat beside the fire in the cabin again, as rain drummed gently on the roof. Her hand in his, her breath soft, steady. Outside, the world was still wide and watching. But inside, they had built something not even thunder could touch. And when the storm passed, the land would remember the night two souls stood their ground, not for country, not for law, but for the quiet, borderless love that had begun in a river and taken root in the dust. The storm lingered in the air for days. Not in the sky, that had cleared by morning, but in the way the land held still, as if listening for the next bootstep to break its hush. May rose early each day, barefoot on the porch, watering the seeds she'd planted near the fence line. They hadn't sprouted yet, but she tended them like they would, like they must. Her hands moved gently through the dirt, and her eyes were steady on the horizon, watching the trail that wound toward town. John carved fence posts, fixed the roof where the rain had found a seam, hauled water from the well like nothing had changed. But something had. There was a new weight in how he saddled the horse, a new sharpness in the way he looked toward the hills. He didn't say it aloud, but she could see it in him. They had survived the warning, not the war. They sat together each evening, side by side on the steps, not speaking much. Her head on his shoulder. His hand over hers. And though the world beyond their clearing stayed hostile and full of teeth, the quiet between them had become something like armor. But peace, for them, had never been left alone for long. It came again, not with horses this time, but with fire. Smoke rose beyond the ridge late one night, black against the stars. May saw it first, her hand pressing to John's chest before he'd even stirred. They stepped outside together and watched the flames lick the night like it was made of paper. "It's the old mission," John said. May's eyes widened. "Reverend?" He didn't answer. By the time they reached it, the chapel was a hollow shell. Ash fell like snow on the grass. The door hung off its hinge, blackened and burned. A wooden cross lay split in two beside the stones where they'd once spoken their vows. Reverend Gaines was gone. Not dead, there were no bodies, but gone. So was the sister. No sign of struggle. Just absence, stark and silent. On the church door, scrawled in thick tar, were 3 words. "This isn't over." They stood there, the heat still radiating from the ruins. May didn't cry. She didn't speak. But she stepped toward the ashes, picked up the shattered cross, and ran her hand along its edge until her fingers were marked with soot. John watched her, knowing now that the law wasn't the only thing after them. It was fear. It was hate. It was everything that saw her not as a woman, but a breach. They rode back home before dawn. No words between them, just the rhythm of hooves and the rising sound of their breathing. When they reached the cabin, John locked the door for the first time in years. The next day, he went into town alone. May waited on the porch, hands folded, eyes on the tree line. When he returned, he carried papers. Official ones. His name on hers, signed and witnessed. Marriage certified again. Stamped by the judge in the county seat, not the preacher. A legal knot. "She's my wife," he'd said in that courtroom. "Same as if she was born down the street." The judge had narrowed his eyes but signed it. Perhaps out of duty. Perhaps out of exhaustion. Perhaps because he saw something in John's face that didn't ask permission anymore. He handed May the folded paper like it was more than parchment, like it was a promise. She read it slowly, tracing the letters with her finger. "I have name," she said softly. "Real name." "Always did," John said. "Now it's just written down." They planted trees the next morning. Plum trees, just 2 saplings, side by side near the porch. She tied red thread around each one and whispered something in her native tongue as she did it. John didn't ask what the words meant. He didn't need to. But even as they pressed roots into the ground, trouble found its way back. It came one evening with a knock like before. But this time, it wasn't Cray. A younger man stood there. Nervous. Thin. Hat in his hand, eyes darting behind him like shadows followed close. "You're the one who married that girl, right?" he asked. John didn't answer. The man swallowed. I heard what happened to the mission. They're coming for her. Not just lawmen. Town boys. Some say she's dangerous. That she brings bad luck. John stepped onto the porch. You believe that? No, the man said quickly. I just thought you should know. John nodded once. Closed the door behind him. They didn't run this time. They stayed. John loaded the rifle and set it by the door. May lit candles around the cabin and made rice with dried apples, the way her mother once had. That night, they didn't speak of fear. They sat at the table, holding hands, and ate slowly. The wind howled once, then went quiet. Nothing came. The next day, John rode into town again, this time, not to ask, not to beg. He stood on the steps of the general store while men leaned on railings and spit tobacco in the dirt. She's my wife, he said, voice even. She lives on my land. She's done no harm. If any of you think otherwise, come speak to me. Man to man. No one did. Mrs. Lindell stepped forward, holding a jar of pickled onions. She's a good woman, she said. She made me tea last week and asked about my boy. Someone scoffed. She turned. And what's your wife done lately, Charlie? She asked coldly. Silence held after that. John returned to the cabin with sugar, flour, and a new shawl the color of spring. He handed it to May without a word. She unfolded it, touched the stitching, then looked up at him with something so gentle it made his heart ache. You fight for me, she said. I fight with you, he corrected. Outside, the plum trees had begun to bud. Just tiny green shoots at first. But real. Certain. Alive. They stood beneath them, hands dirty from the soil, arms around each other. The world didn't stop hating. But it stopped knocking, for now. And in the quiet that followed, they made something lasting. May began teaching him her language, a few words at a time. He taught her to read the constellations, the names he'd learned from his father, back when maps were drawn in stars. Together, they built a second room to the cabin. Hung up her drawings on the walls. Added a rocking chair that didn't creak. Every day, they chose each other again. And when the wind blew through the valley, carrying whispers from the townsfolk, the past, the river, it found no fear inside that cabin. Only warmth. Only two names carved side by side on the porch rail. May. John. Love like this, they learned, didn't need borders. It needed only courage, and time, and the silence in which it could grow. And when strangers passed through and asked who the Chinese woman was who lived with the cowboy in the hills, the answer was always the same. She's his wife. And that was all that needed saying.